Thank you all so much for coming here and braving the very British and very inclement weather today. I really appreciate you coming along here. It takes quite a bit, I think, to put the Brits off any outdoor event. I often think we prefer it in the rain. Now, you've come here to hear Daniel Hannan, not me. So I just want to say a very brief word that I'm Simon Richards, Director of the Freedom Association. We're very committed to letting people know how important Magna Carta is and how important our traditional British freedoms are. And so earlier in the year we produced this booklet, which many of you have seen, which is trying to put Magna Carta in a way that people can understand, including school children. So we're distributing a lot of these. Now that's enough for me, and I just want to say that we're very, very proud to have Daniel Hannan here today. He's been a long-standing supporter of the Freedom Association, but much more important than that, a wonderful advocate for freedom and for liberty. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a very big round of applause to Mr. Daniel Hannan.
At Runnymede, your rights were won at Runnymede. No freeman shall be fined or bound or dispossessed of freehold ground except by lawful judgment, found and passed upon him by his peers. Remember, after all these years, the Charter signed at Runnymede. My friends, we stand on something approximating hallowed ground. The English are not a notably spiritual people, but standing in this place, we feel an echo of sanctity. What occurred here 800 years ago was a little secular miracle. And the text that emerged is to the English-speaking peoples our Torah, the text that sets us apart and at the same time, paradoxically, providentially, also a text that speaks universally to the human species. There are a small number of original copies of the Great Charter from the 13th century. Many of them are housed in England's cathedrals, revered and tended like the relics that were removed at the Reformation. One hangs in the Australian Parliament in Canberra. Another alongside the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution in Washington, D.C. If we're looking for the foundational Anglosphere text, this is it. The copy at Lincoln Cathedral is often held to be the best preserved, and it was one of the four of the contemporaneous ones, the ones actually signed here on this field. There are two in the British Library, one at Salisbury and one at Lincoln. You can visit them now without any particular fuss. There's no queue, there's no great excitement. When that same copy from Lincoln Cathedral was exhibited in New York in 1939, an almost unbelievable 14 million people crushed in to see it. The Second World War broke out while it was still on display, and it remained in Fort Knox for safekeeping until the victory. The aptest possible symbol of what the English-speaking peoples were fighting for, namely a system that elevates the individual over the state, rather than the other way around. Sometimes you hear the argument that we've recently romanticized the events that took place at Runnymede, that we've imbued them with a significance that was not apparent to the actors. But that interpretation depends on averting our eyes from much of what has been said in the intervening 8 centuries. Every generation of English-speaking peoples have tended to treat this text much as the great Romantic historians of the 19th century did, namely as a guarantor of their rights against arbitrary government. Magna Carta had been reissued more than 40 times by the beginning of the 15th century. In the Civil War, it was repeatedly cited by defenders of parliamentary supremacy as the source of their inspiration and their legitimacy. When the new model army arrived in London and Sir Thomas Fairfax, its commander, was appointed as Warden of the Tower of London, his first act was to call for a copy of the Great Charter and to breathe reverentially as he saw it, "This is that we have fought for, and by God's help we must maintain." More than a century later, imprisoned in that same tower, John Wilkes described Magna Carta as the distinguishing characteristic of all Englishmen, under which heading he, of course, included all Americans, whose rights he strongly championed. Closer to our own time, Lord Denning, perhaps the most celebrated jurist of the 20th century, had this to say: "Magna Carta is the greatest constitutional document of all time, the foundation of the freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot." After those paeans of praise, it can sometimes be a shock to read the entirety of the text for the first time and see quite how many of its clauses are taken up with the minutiae of inheritance laws, with the lending of money to Jews, with the treatment of Welsh hostages, with the placing of fish traps in the Thames. What's all the fuss about? Why do I talk in the way that I do about this very old event? Well, most of the clauses of the Charter were tided away in the legal rewritings and rationalizations of the 19th century. 3 still remain on the statute book, and those 3 give us some sense of why it matters. The first guarantees the freedom of the church, basis of that separation of church and state power, of ecclesiastical and civil law, which became the foundation of modern freedom. The second guarantees the freedom of the City of London and of other towns and corporations. But it's the third that matters most, because it contains the genesis of what we today understand by due process. And it was this that Kipling was referring to in the verse I opened with. I'll give you the full version from one of the English language 13th century versions. "No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or be disseized of his freehold or liberties or free customs, or be outlawed or exiled or any otherwise destroyed. Nor will not pass upon him, nor condemn him, but by lawful judgment of his peers, and by the law of the land." Ponder for a moment that phrase, the law of the land. It's passed into our everyday speech now. In all English-speaking societies, peculiarly. It's not a phrase one hears elsewhere. Think of what that means. Not the king's law, not some divine law, but the law of the land, a law that was somehow immanent in the people and their territory. It's natural to take things for granted, to be blasé about what's familiar. But how extraordinary, how radical, how transformative this idea that the law was above the government rather than the other way around. That the law was not something invented by the biggest man in the tribe or by the king, but that somehow it was there. You couldn't see it, you couldn't touch it, you couldn't hear it or smell it, but it was more powerful than even the strongest king. Never until this moment, 800 years ago, that moment of planetary significance, had anybody encoded that ideal. And it was more than an ideal. It had real force because it came with an inbuilt enforcement mechanism. In our own age, we have charters and declarations and proclamations of civil rights coming out of our ears. Virtually every country, virtually every international association promotes some declaration of liberties or freedoms. They are worthless without an enforcement mechanism. Compared to Magna Carta, the Constitution of East Germany or the Soviet Union looked a far more uplifting document, guaranteeing as it did freedom of religion and assembly and so on. But as the peoples of those unhappy states realized, the greatest rights are worth nothing if they're written only on paper without some means to hold the rulers to account. And the genius of our fathers was to build into the Charter the beginnings of conciliar government, of a mechanism to have an interpretation of this law of the land that was neither the king nor the barons, but some assembly purporting to speak for a wider political community. Our Parliament became synonymous with our freedom. It took another half century to go from Runnymede to Westminster, as it were, to go to regular meetings of what was eventually to become the House of Commons. But the link was always there. We did not contract out our freedoms to some Supreme Court and trust them to secure our civil rights. The responsibility was with each of us, acting as voters, to ensure that we remained a free people. And compared to every other country, you know what? Our system worked. We didn't fall to dictatorship or to revolution. We had no time for fascism or for communism. We remained a civil democracy because we had made the defense of freedom everybody's business, rather than the business of a constitutional tribunal. And that's what we remember here. When somebody says to you, mockingly, "Come on, it was only a deal between a cornered king and his mutinous nobles, a deal that the king broke at the first moment possible. What's all the fuss about?" There is a very simple answer, and it's the answer that appears on the memorial stone behind me. To commemorate Magna Carta, symbol of freedom under the law. In those spare, austere, unenhanced words, you have more beauty and more purity than in any flowery constitution filled with the minutiae of rights. Who raised this memorial? You can all see the answer carved around you. The site went unmarked until 1957, when this stone was finally raised here by the American Bar Association. Magna Carta has always been a rather bigger deal to the cousins than it has in this country. I don't know if any of you remembers the Prime Minister's interview on American television last year when he was interviewed by David Letterman, and he was asked, what does Magna Carta mean? What do the words mean? I don't believe that he didn't know that. I don't believe it's possible to have spent 5 years at a hothouse prep school and then another 5 at Eton doing Latin as a compulsory subject and not know what it means. Well, maybe it's possible. Churchill did once in the House of Commons famously translate a piece of Latin for the benefit of any Etonians who might be present. But I think it is stretching credulity a little bit that David Cameron wouldn't know what magna means. It's a first declension adjective, and Carter, well, you can pretty much infer that one from context, can't you? I think he was playing the role of a Hugh Grant-type British Prime Minister. He's a very charming fellow. Americans don't like clever dicks, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing. But it was very flattering to the audience. And of course, most Americans do know a lot more about Magna Carta because their fathers left these shores at the moment when the mania for the Charter was at its height. And they carried with them that bias and disposition to their new homes. As early as 1638, Maryland asked permission to build Magna Carta into its state charter. The document was repeatedly reissued on US shores. In 1775, the state of Massachusetts approved as its symbol a patriot with a sword in one hand and a copy of Magna Carta in the other. The US Supreme Court has cited the Charter more than 100 times in its rulings. What happened in the old courthouse in Philadelphia when the ideals of this Charter took form as the US Constitution was a second secular miracle. And it is as much our patrimony as what happened here. We share, all of the English-speaking peoples, this sublime inheritance. Those of you here, and anyone who chances to see this film clip, whether in San Francisco or in Sligo or in Singapore, we are all heirs to that joint inheritance of freedom under the law. one of the aspects of the genius of this country was to develop a civil rather than an ethnic conception of nationhood. We defined our nationality not with reference to place or race, but with reference to ideals. Americans will often tell you with justified pride that theirs is a propositional country, but that was not something that developed in a vacuum. The first settlers there had carried with them the idea of creedal nationality, the idea that you can become English or later British by signing up to a set of ideals. Ideals that were powerful enough, twice in the last century, to drag millions of young men halfway across the world, to take up arms for a country in which, in most cases, they'd never set eyes, because they believed that they were better than what the other side stood for. Wherever our ancestors came from, this is our shared inheritance. And don't imagine that it's something that is common to every country or even every Western country. The things that we take for granted, a free press, regular elections, habeas corpus, equality for women, jury trials, these are not the natural condition of an advanced society. They are very specific products of the civilization that expressed itself in the language that I'm now talking. You don't have to go back very far to see a time when these ideals were wholly confined to the English-speaking world. In August 1941, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt met on the decks of HMS Prince of Wales. Churchill was trying to encourage the American leader to join the war. It's the one time that FDR walked. He disguised the fact of his polio from the electorate for 10 years up until then, but he was determined to rise literally to the occasion. It was a Sunday morning, and Churchill had the crews of the two vessels, the USS Augusta and HMS Prince of Wales, paraded for a joint religious service. He'd chosen every detail meticulously, down to the hymns that were shared by the two countries, down to the readings from the King James Bible, revered alike on both sides of the Atlantic. It came from Joshua 1, "As I was with Moses, so shall I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage." And afterwards, ecstatically, Churchill said, the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And when he talked about the same ideals, he wasn't making some bland generalization about being the good guys. Look at the world from the perspective of 1941. Look at how unusual freedom and democracy and individualism were. How recently these things were struggling for their survival. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Brest and Lisbon to Vladivostok, were under different forms of authoritarianism. The spread of democracy and freedom, in reality, came about from a succession of military victories by the English-speaking peoples. That is our boast and our inheritance. That is our supreme contribution to the happiness of mankind. And that imposes on us a duty as invigilators and guardians of an extraordinary tradition. We are not simply a random set of individuals. Whichever land our grandparents were born in, we are now heirs to an extraordinary and unique shared inheritance. It's our duty to pass that inheritance on intact to our children. The day may come when our power wanes and all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. But as long as English is spoken, and as long as we recall what happened here, we will never be just another people. Remember, after all these years, the Charter signed at Runnymede.